Picture this. It's early morning, somewhere in ancient West Africa, around 70,000 years ago, and a man is doing something that would, if observed by a modern fitness enthusiast, produce a complicated mix of admiration and existential crisis. He's been moving continuously since before dawn, not jogging on a maintained trail with supportive footwear and a hydration pack. Moving across genuinely varied terrain, carrying a load that would qualify as a challenging weighted vest by any modern gym standard, scanning his environment constantly, adapting his pace to whatever the ground demands, occasionally sprinting briefly when something requires it, and doing all of this with the casual, unhurried competence of someone for whom this level of physical output is simply what Tuesday morning looks like. He has not thought about exercise once. He has not calculated his heart rate zone. He has not checked whether this counts as cardio or strength training. He does not own a gym membership, does not have a monthly fitness goal, and would find the concept of deliberately exercising without any productive outcome genuinely baffling, along the lines of deliberately walking in circles to practice walking. He's doing what ancient humans did every day, moving because the world required movement, with a frequency and variety and physical demand that would leave most modern people face down on the ground by mid-morning. So here's what this video exists to properly investigate. Did ancient humans actually exercise? Not in the modern, deliberate, scheduled, outcome-tracked sense, but did they move their bodies in ways that produced the physiological effects we now pursue through structured exercise programs? Were ancient human bodies as fit as the evolutionary health narrative claims? And what does the actual skeletal and behavioral evidence tell us about ancient human physical capability that changes how we understand our own bodies and their relationship to movement? Stick around because the answers are more specific, more surprising, and more directly relevant to modern life than vague statements about ancient humans being really active could ever fully convey. The framing problem deserves immediate attention because it shapes everything else. Exercise, as modern culture understands it, is a specific, somewhat peculiar concept. It means deliberate physical movement undertaken specifically for its physiological benefits, disconnected from any immediate productive purpose, scheduled into a specific time window, and typically measured against fitness metrics. This concept is extraordinarily recent in human history. For the overwhelming majority of the 200,000 plus years that anatomically modern ancient humans have existed, no one exercised in this sense because no one needed to. Movement was simply embedded in survival, not separated from it as a distinct, deliberate activity pursued for health maintenance. This distinction matters because asking whether ancient humans exercised in the modern sense is almost a category error, like asking whether ancient humans had careers. The relevant question is whether ancient human daily life produced physical demands equivalent to or exceeding what structured modern exercise programs aim to recreate, and whether ancient human physical capability reflected those demands in ways the evidence can demonstrate. On both counts, the answer is an unambiguous yes that the skeletal record, comparative physiology research, and studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer populations make very clear. The skeletal evidence starts with bone morphology, and the story it tells is specific enough to be striking. Researchers examining ancient human skeletal remains consistently find levels of bone density and robusticity, the thickness and structural strength of bones reflecting lifetime mechanical loading, that significantly exceed what is typical in modern sedentary populations. This isn't a subtle difference. Ancient human long bones, femurs, tibias, humeri show cross-sectional geometry and cortical thickness reflecting lifetime patterns of mechanical loading that would be unusual to find in anyone who wasn't a serious, committed, long-term athlete by modern standards. The specific pattern matters too, not just overall bone density, but the distribution of bone tissue in ways that reflect the specific mechanical demands experienced across a lifetime. Ancient human lower limb bones show loading, patterns consistent with sustained, varied, terrain-adaptive locomotion, not the repetitive, single-plane loading of modern running on flat surfaces, but the multi-directional, variable intensity loading of moving across genuinely diverse terrain carrying loads. Upper limb bones show patterns consistent with regular load carrying and powerful throwing. the specific mechanical signature of a hunting lifestyle rather than the more isolated movement patterns of modern weight training. Muscle attachment sites, the specific bony prominences where muscles insert and through which they exert force on the skeleton, are more pronounced in ancient skeletal remains than in modern population samples, reflecting greater muscle mass and stronger, more frequent muscular exertion across the lifetime. These sites are, in a sense, permanent records of physical activity written into the bone, growing more prominent as mechanical demands require greater muscle development and gradually diminishing when those demands are reduced. Ancient human remains consistently show the prominent attachment sites of people who were physically powerful and remained physically active across their lifetimes, not the diminished attachment sites that characterize sedentary modern populations. Osteoarthritis patterns in ancient remains are interesting and somewhat counterintuitive. Heavy physical use of joints across a lifetime does produce accelerated joint wear in some cases, and certain ancient skeletal remains show joint degeneration consistent with the physical demands of their lifestyle. But the pattern differs significantly from the osteoarthritis common in modern sedentary populations, which often reflects the combination of reduced muscle support around joints, weight carried without corresponding movement, and the specific biomechanical consequences of postures and movement patterns shaped by sedentary environments rather than by genuine physical demands. Joint health in active populations, whether ancient or modern, tends to look different from joint health in sedentary populations, with the protective effects of strong periarticular musculature, appropriate loading, and the movement patterns produced by physically demanding lifestyles partially offsetting the wear effects of high activity levels. The ancient skeletal pattern, generally strong bone, pronounced muscle attachment, and joint wear reflecting genuine use rather than sedentary degradation, reflects a physical life that was demanding but functionally well supported. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer and subsistence agriculture populations provide comparative evidence about what physical capability looks like in humans whose daily lives involve high physical demands across a lifetime. These populations consistently show physical capabilities in domains like grip strength, aerobic capacity, functional movement quality, and muscular endurance that exceed modern Western population averages, reflecting lifetime patterns of physical demand rather than any extraordinary genetic advantage. When researchers test specific physical capabilities in these populations, the results tend to be impressive across the board, not because their genes are different, but because their physical capabilities reflect what human biology produces when it's loaded with the demands that the ancient human world provided as a matter of daily routine. The specific physical demands that ancient human life imposed deserve detailed examination, because understanding their variety and magnitude helps clarify why ancient human physical capability was so consistently high. Walking was the most constant demand, as we discussed extensively in our walking distance video, but the character of that walking was importantly different from modern leisure walking in ways that make simple distance comparisons inadequate. Ancient walking happened across genuinely varied terrain, including gradient changes, unstable surfaces, obstacles, water crossings, and passages through vegetation that engaged the full kinetic chain in ways that flat surface walking simply does not. Load carrying was an enormous component of ancient physical life that modern exercise culture has only recently started systematically recreating through rucking and loaded carries. Ancient humans carried significant loads as a routine component of daily activity, food from successful hunts and foraging expeditions, water in containers of substantial weight, infants, and young children who couldn't yet travel independently, tools and materials needed across travel distances, materials for shelter construction and maintenance. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Carrying loads changes the physical demand of movement in ways that engage core stability, postural musculature, and lower limb strength well beyond what unloaded walking requires. And this loaded movement happened continuously across ancient daily life rather than as a scheduled exercise event. Digging was another consistent physical demand with a specific muscular profile. Gathering root vegetables, the tubers and corms that formed significant caloric contributions to ancient diets across many environments, required repeated digging activity that loaded the upper body and core differently from walking or carrying. Shelter construction involved moving substantial materials, shaping and fitting structural elements, and sustained labor with tools that imposed specific upper body demands. Fire maintenance, hide processing, tool making, all of these camp-based activities involved sustained postures and repetitive movements that loaded specific muscle groups consistently. Sprinting and explosive movement, while not constant, were recurrent features of ancient life that imposed high-intensity demands different in character from the sustained aerobic demands of walking and carrying. Pursuit during active hunting involved periods of rapid movement across difficult terrain. Flight from genuine threats, animal or human, demanded explosive acceleration and sustained high-intensity movement. The hypnic jerk that we discussed in our sleep video, that reflexive full-body startle at the moment of sleep onset, may even reflect the evolutionary legacy of a species that needed to be capable of explosive movement at essentially any moment, including the transition to sleep. The combination of sustained aerobic work, load-carrying, explosive movement, and varied physical demand that ancient life imposed is worth comparing to modern exercise prescription frameworks, because this comparison is illuminating. What ancient life provided matches quite closely with the principles underlying periodized training programs designed to develop broad physical capability. Varied intensity with both sustained aerobic work and high-intensity intervals, loaded movement engaging stabilizing musculature that isolated machine-based exercises bypass, functional multiplane movement rather than repetitive single-plane patterns, continuous distribution across the day rather than concentrated in specific windows. The last point is particularly significant. Modern exercise, however well designed, is typically concentrated into specific time windows surrounded by extended sedentary periods, a pattern that research on metabolic health has identified as problematic even when the exercise itself is adequate. Ancient physical activity was distributed across the day, with movement happening continuously rather than concentrated into one or two specific active periods surrounded by extended sitting. This distribution appears to matter for various metabolic outcomes beyond what the total volume of activity alone would predict, and it reflects the fundamental difference between ancient physical life and modern exercise culture, not just how much movement happened, but when and how it was distributed. Something worth examining directly is whether ancient humans experienced anything analogous to the deliberate cultivation of physical capability beyond what daily survival demands automatically provided. There's interesting, if somewhat speculative, territory here around whether ancient humans engaged in any activity resembling training, deliberate practice aimed at improving physical capabilities rather than simply exercising those capabilities in the service of immediate productive goals. Wrestling and physical competition show up across essentially every documented human culture, including cultures at relatively early stages of social complexity. The impulse toward physical competition, testing and developing physical capabilities through structured contests with other people appears to be deeply rooted in human behavioral tendencies. Whether this represents genuine physical training in the ancient context is uncertain, but the combination of play behavior, social competition, and the specific skill development that physical competition produces suggests that at least some ancient physical activity may have had a training component beyond pure survival necessity. Children's play in any population serves partly as physical capability development, with rough and tumble play, climbing, throwing, and running games, all building the physical competencies that adult survival demands. This developmental physical activity, while not exercise in the adult deliberate practice sense, represents a form of physical capability cultivation that was embedded in ancient childhood in ways we documented in our Ancient Children video. The physical competencies that adult ancient humans possessed were the product of both daily adult physical demands and the extensive physical play and developmental activity of ancient childhood. Throwing deserves specific attention as a physical skill that likely received something approaching deliberate practice in ancient contexts. We discussed the extraordinary physical demands of skilled throwing in our thumbs and hunting videos, and the specific combination of shoulder mobility, rotator cuff strength, core stability, and neuromuscular coordination that accurate, powerful throwing requires. These physical qualities don't develop automatically from general daily activity. They develop through specific repeated practice of the throwing movement itself, and ancient hunters for whom throwing accuracy was a direct survival determinant had strong incentives to develop this capability to the highest level possible. The practice sessions that ancient hunters almost certainly engaged in, throwing at targets with increasing challenge as skill developed, represent the most direct analog to deliberate training in the ancient context. This isn't speculative. Contemporary hunter gatherer populations maintain throwing skill through practice, children begin throwing practice at young ages, and adult hunters continue working on throwing accuracy because its practical value is obvious and direct. Ancient hunters doing the same represents a reasonable inference from both practical necessity and the observable behavior of analogous contemporary populations. The athletic capabilities that ancient human physical life developed were impressive by any modern standard, and worth characterizing specifically rather than leaving as vague impressiveness. Sustained aerobic capacity, the ability to move continuously across terrain for hours, was fundamental to persistence hunting, long-distance foraging, migration, and general daily movement. Ancient humans who couldn't sustain aerobic effort across a full day were simply less effective at survival, and selection across many generations produced a species with remarkable aerobic potential that modern sedentary lifestyles dramatically under-realize. Functional strength, the kind of practical strength that applies across varied movement patterns and unstable situations rather than in isolated machine-controlled exercises, was developed across ancient life through exactly the varied, loaded, unstable demands of real-world physical activity. The carrying, digging, hauling, climbing, and general physical work of ancient daily life produced functional strength that shows in the pronounced muscle attachment sites we see in ancient skeletal remains. Strength built through genuine use rather than optimized training protocols. Balance and proprioception, the ability to navigate varied terrain safely and effectively, were continuously developed and maintained through the constant challenge of moving across genuinely demanding surfaces. Modern research on movement quality in populations with high physical activity levels consistently finds that people who move frequently across varied terrain maintain balance and proprioceptive capabilities that sedentary populations progressively lose, with falls and balance-related injuries being more common in populations whose physical activity doesn't include the kind of varied terrain navigation that continuously challenges these systems. What did ancient humans not have that modern exercise culture provides? Access to any systematic framework for understanding physical development, for periodizing training, for targeting specific deficiencies in physical capability through structured intervention. An ancient human with a strength imbalance or a movement quality limitation had no method for identifying and addressing it beyond the general physical demands of daily life, which might or might not load the deficient areas adequately. The sophistication of modern physical training methodology, whatever its limitations, represents genuine applied knowledge about how to develop physical capability that ancient humans didn't possess. Ancient humans also had no protection from the specific physical damage that extreme overuse can produce. The physical demands of ancient life weren't calibrated to any individual's current capacity. If a particularly demanding period, a difficult migration, an extended hunting expedition, a season of intensive shelter construction imposed demands beyond what any individual could sustain without injury, there was no option to scale back programmatically as a modern coach might prescribe. The consequences of musculoskeletal injury in the ancient world were also considerably more severe than in modern contexts, with no medical intervention available beyond the practical folk medicine and social support systems we've discussed throughout this series. The recovery dimension of physical training is one area where modern understanding genuinely exceeds ancient practice. Modern exercise science has developed sophisticated understanding of how recovery between training stimuli affects adaptation, how sleep quality influences physical recovery, how nutrition supports muscle repair, and how to modulate training load to avoid the diminishing returns and injury risk of chronic overtraining. Ancient physical life had none of this systematic recovery management, with physical demands imposed by circumstances rather than planned to optimize adaptation. Nutrition supporting physical performance was available in the ancient world in the sense that the high protein, varied nutrient diet that characterizes hunter gatherer eating, discussed in detail across various earlier videos in this series, provided adequate raw material for sustaining high physical demands. But the specific optimization of nutritional timing, macronutrient ratios for specific physical outcomes, and supplementation strategies that characterize modern sports nutrition was entirely absent. With ancient athletes, if they can be called that, fueling through whatever the environment provided rather than through any planned performance nutrition. Sleep, which modern exercise science identifies as the most important recovery tool available, was almost certainly adequate in ancient contexts in terms of total duration and sleep quality, as we discussed in our sleep transition video. Ancient humans likely slept more hours than the chronically sleep-deprived modern norm in sleeping environments with natural light cycle entrainment rather than artificial light disruption, producing sleep quality that supported physical recovery effectively even without any understanding of why sleep mattered for physical adaptation. The combined picture that emerges from skeletal evidence, comparative physiology, biomechanical analysis, and contemporary hunter-gatherer population studies is coherent and specific. Ancient humans were physically capable at levels that would be impressive by any modern standard, not through any special genetic endowment, but through lifetime patterns of physical demand that modern sedentary environments don't provide. They achieved this without deliberate exercise programs, without exercise science, and without any understanding of the physiological mechanisms underlying physical adaptation, simply by living in a world that required constant, varied, substantial physical output as a condition of survival. The specific capabilities they developed sustained aerobic capacity, functional strength, balance and proprioceptive acuity, throwing power, the endurance for load carrying across terrain, reflect the specific demands their world imposed. Not a perfectly rounded athletic development, but a capability profile shaped by what survival actually required day to day. This profile happened to produce high overall physical capability because the demands of ancient survival were themselves high and varied, not because ancient humans were trying to achieve fitness. So did ancient humans actually exercise? In the deliberate, scheduled, fitness goal-oriented modern sense, no, almost certainly not as a common practice, and the very concept would have been puzzling to anyone living before the conditions that make sedentary lifestyles possible. In the sense that matters more, did ancient human life produce physical demands that developed and maintained high physical capability across lifetimes? Yes. Comprehensively and demonstrably, in ways that the skeletal record has been showing researchers for decades, ways that modern exercise science is partially attempting to recreate through structured programs that simulate what ancient daily life provided automatically as a consequence of simply being alive in a world that required you to move. The man we started with, moving across ancient West African terrain since before dawn, with a load that would challenge a modern gym-goer and terrain that would end a modern trail runner's day early, wasn't exercising. He was living. The physical capability that represented was exactly the same physical capability every morning, and he never once had to motivate himself to show up for it.